our next unit is on evolutionary theory. So what do we think of when we hear the word evolution?
World
Charles
changing.
Darwin.
Changing. Charles Darwin, monkeys.
That ape thing.
The ape thing, like the thing with all the different people. National Geographic. Okay, so yes, we're going to talk about what evolution actually is, and there are some misconceptions about evolution that we'll try to clear up as we go through. So we're going to start kind of from the beginning. This first section is on spontaneous generation. Back in the day, people did not really understand where things came from. They knew where people came from because they can watch people being born. But they thought that things like insects or mice or things like that, other little animals and things, just kind of spontaneously generated out of nowhere. They used to think that mice came from dirty underwear, like if you didn't clean your clothes, they would turn into mice and rats and bugs and stuff like that. So we know that in the past people have had some incorrect ideas about things because they didn't see, baby mice being born. They just didn't know where they came from. So we are going to talk about how we figured out eventually where living things come from. That they do not spontaneously generate, that they have babies like we do, and the idea that they are created from non-living matter, which we have determined to be incorrect, is called spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis. So as we do this, we're going to go through some scientists that contributed to our knowledge. We're eventually going to make a timeline out of all these scientists we're learning about, because it does get kind of confusing to have all these different names and to associate what they did. So this first guy is Francesco Redi. He set out to disprove spontaneous generation. And what they had noticed was that when you let food or meat sit out for a while, what do you notice on top of the food or meat after a long period of time? Mold. What else might you notice? Flies. But before they get to flies, maggots. Right. So what are maggots?
Baby flies.
Okay. Some people don't know that. Okay. Some people think maggots are just like little caterpillars or something. No, that's the larva of a fly. So those are baby flies. So what happens is the flies come, they lay their eggs on the meat, and when the eggs hatch, they have something to eat. They eat the meat. They turn into maggots, and then eventually they turn into regular flies, and they take off and fly around. But back in the day, they thought that the meat spontaneously generated into maggots, like the meat literally turned into a maggot, which we know is not the truth. So he did this little experiment. Okay, he placed raw meat into some containers. Some of them had a lid, some of them had like a cheesecloth lid over them. And what do you think he observed?
Wait, the flies. What kind of, was it all the same type of meat, or was it steak?
It was all the same type of meat. We'll say it's steak because in the picture it looks like steak. What do you think he noticed from this experiment then?
The open jar gets ate most.
The open jar had what?
Gets ate most.
Has stuff in it, yes. The tightly sealed jars do not. The jars covered with cloth do not, because obviously the holes in the cloth were not big enough for the flies.
How long did he leave them out for?
I don't actually know. Probably a week or two. That's all it would take to get maggots in it. But he is also credited with having the first controlled experiment, because he's the first one to say, okay, this is the control group, this is the experimental group. He had uncovered jars, he had covered jars. So basically he disproved spontaneous generation by showing that only the uncovered jars had maggots on them. Okay. So any questions on what he did? All right, are we ready to move on to our next person? This could be when you pause. Did you pause?
Yeah.
The person is Louis Pasteur. Has anybody heard of Louis Pasteur before? Anybody know what he did or what he's famous for?
Pasteurized milk.
Pasteurization, yes. So he came up with the process for pasteurization, which basically is boiling or heating liquids up to a certain temperature that kills all the bacteria. So a lot of us are alive today because of a lot of the things that Louis Pasteur figured out.
We love you.
He what?
We love him.
Yes, we love him. He's good. So they figured out the flies. Okay, eventually they figured out that mice did not come from dirty underwear. But at some point they discovered bacteria. Okay, and bacteria were discovered probably about 100 years after the first guy. Because we developed microscopes, so they were able to see bacteria. They could also see bacteria if it was growing in a liquid, such as a broth. And then they kind of went back to their old way of thinking that bacteria was spontaneously generating out of the air or spontaneously generating out of the broth, which we know today is not true. So Pasteur came up with this idea that microorganisms come from other microorganisms. Bacteria split in half. That's how they reproduce. They don't just pop out of nowhere from the air. So he came up with this idea to test this. He came up with this special flask, which you'll need to do a sketch of in your notes. This is called the Swan neck flask. It's a very famous part of scientific lab equipment that everybody that's in science recognizes the Swan neck flask. So basically he heated it up, boiled it to kill the bacteria. Now the importance of the swan neck allows air to enter the flask, but bacteria cannot swim or travel. They can't move through this area. So if a bacteria landed on the flask, it would land on the outside, but it couldn't make its way into the broth. So it was keeping bacteria out, but letting air in. And then no bacteria were able to get into here. So he came up with the idea that if bacteria were spontaneously generating from the air, they should have been able to get in, and they didn't. Okay, so that disproves spontaneous generation for microorganisms. And like I said, this is one of his many contributions to science. He did a lot with microorganisms and saving people from diseases and that kind of stuff, as well as pasteurization. All right, so everybody sketched their little flask. All right, any questions on this? Are we ready to move on from Pasteur? The way I remember him, like when you go to remember all these scientists, I think of swans, and I think of swans in a pasture, like a grassy area. Swans in a pasture. You don't have to use my ideas.
Oh, don't. I have to write too.
Okay. Ow, that's not gonna work. If it takes you twice as long, then it's not gonna work.
Huh? You want me to pause it?
Yes.
No. 3, 2.
No, already. God.
Okay, so here is just another illustration of his experiment. So you have your swan neck flask, the broth gets boiled, it kills the bacteria. The broth remains free, so obviously the bacteria are not coming from the air. He did eventually break off the curved neck, which allowed bacteria to get in from the top, and then the microorganisms started growing in the broth. All right, we're going to come back to this. Remind me to come back to the video. So Pasteur's experiment led to this idea of biogenesis. Biogenesis says that living organisms only come from other living organisms. Okay, so we have babies, bacteria have babies, mice have babies, flies have babies.
Anything that's basically living has babies.
Yes.
Plants technically have
Well, there's baby plants, yes. So all living things, if you're a living thing, you had parents of some kind. You came from other living things. You don't just come out of nowhere.
The first microorganism wouldn't have that.
We're going to talk about where did the first ones come from, because that's always the question when I say that, is where did the first ones come from?
And that big rock.
All right, you ready for this? You don't have to write much on this. Okay, so putting all this together, we come up with the theory of evolution. And really, the only thing evolution says is that things change over time. Okay? There's this big debate about, evolution versus creation. They don't contradict each other. Creation is the creation of something, and evolution is just once it's already created, how did it change? So there's not really a contradiction there. So you just need to understand that evolution, if you look at life on Earth and things on Earth over time, things have changed. Like, we don't see dinosaurs outside now. You know, things are different than they were 1 million years ago or 65 million years ago, right? And we can see some of that, you know, just as we live our lives, how things have changed over time since you were born from how it is now. Organic evolution says that things have changed from simple to more complex. Those very, very first organisms that he just mentioned were much simpler than they are today. You know, that's why we didn't start with humans. Humans were not the first things on the earth. Little tiny microbes were the first things on the earth. So we've gone from simple to more complex over time. Any questions on that? All right, so evolution is based on your ancestry, which is just the history of your ancestors. Has anybody done Ancestry.com? A few of us, I have. It's fun.
I did it on my dog.
I want to do it on my cat, so my husband won't let me do it on the cat. I don't know why. I would
Can't
never
let a
do
man
that.
tell you what to do.
I
like
know.
that.
When money's involved, though, there's probably better things to spend our money on. So, this is Darwin's original drawing that he did when he looked at organisms and tried to figure out how everything was related. But that's basically what it is, figuring out how things are related, which is what you do on your Ancestry.com. So, there's a couple people that came before Darwin. Everybody remembers Darwin, but not necessarily these other poor people. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he was a French scientist. He came up with one of the first theories of evolution. It was called the inheritance of acquired traits. And he believed that organisms changed over time by passing on acquired traits. Okay? Now, acquired traits are things that you get during your lifetime. So what he would have said is, if you dyed your hair purple, let's say that. If you dyed your hair purple, that's an acquired trait that you have acquired. Okay? He would have thought then that if you had a baby, that baby would have been born with purple hair. Okay? We know that's not how it works. So, or if you got a tattoo, your baby's going to be born with the same tattoo. Or if you work out really hard and get big muscles, your baby's going to be born looking like a bodybuilder.
That would be.
So that's not true. We know that's not true. So he understood that traits were passed to offspring, okay? But he didn't understand how they were passed. He didn't understand that it's your genetics that passed them on. He thought that you could just like manipulate your body to how you wanted and pass that on. Okay, so one thing he was looking at was neck size in giraffes, or neck length in giraffes. And back in the day, giraffes used to be shorter than they are. Like, these are old-timey giraffes. They are really short. So over time, giraffes have acquired longer necks through genetics. He thought if they acquired longer necks because they physically would stretch out their necks in order to get to the trees. Okay? So that's like, you know, those of us that are vertically challenged, kind of short, you know, and you have to ask somebody to get stuff down for you all the time. That would be like if we wanted to get something on the top of a shelf and we were able to just stretch our arm out and grab it.
Well, when am I gonna evolve?
SpongeBob who?
Huh?
When am I gonna evolve?
You're
When you're
not.
gonna evolve, it takes a long time.
You're not.
Okay, you will not, but your offspring might. Right? So,
Keyword might.
so we know that we can't do that. So we know that he was incorrect in that aspect. He called that use or disuse. Okay, so if an organism disused a body part, it would shrink and go away and lose function. And if you used a body part, it would grow. Okay? So we know that that's not true, but he was one of our first scientists to come up with an idea for evolution. And then we'll probably need to stop for lunch at this point. Okay, so we said Lamarck was incorrect. The person that is considered to be correct that came up with the theory that we still go with today is Charles Darwin. He was known as the father of evolution. Let me put my thing back in. So he came up with this idea of natural selection, which is one of the main fundamental ideas in science about how things change over time. So in 1831, he took a job on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He went around the world His job was a naturalist, which meant he was in charge of studying the plants and animals that they would find as they went to all these different places, and just like take samples of them and write down what he saw and just kind of map out the life forms of all these different locations. The main famous place that he got a lot of information that he studied was the Galapagos Islands, which is a group of islands off South America. And does anybody know like what particular animals he studied in the Galapagos?
Birds.
Yes.
He studied a species of birds. I forgot the name.
Finch.
Finches? Yes. Any other species you have been taught about him? Yes.
It's like, it looks like a crow, sort of.
That's the finch.
Oh.
The finches, yes. He also studied tortoises. The Galapagos tortoises are all different depending on what island you're on. The tortoises are very different. And the finches are different because what? Why are finches different?
Because of their beaks.
Right. And why are their beaks different?
They ate
The
because
food
they
source
eat
ate different
different
stuff,
things based
right.
on what island they're on.
So that's the main thing that led him to kind of have ideas and come up with his idea of natural selection. The Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands, so they are the result from a volcano coming up from the ocean. They were not always there. So the first question he had to ask is, how did these things get here? So where's the most likely location that they came from originally? What continent did I just say they were next to?
South America.
South America, yes. So anytime you have islands that are volcanic, normally the plants and animals are gonna have to come from somewhere else, probably South America in this case. So he said, well, these animals probably came from South America. Why are they all different on the islands that they're on? Okay, and he kind of came up with this idea. They've adapted over time to survive on the particular island that they ended up on. So here's a map of what I was just describing. Here's South America. Here's the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so he observed that the birds, the finches, were very, very similar to each other except for the beak. Here's a few of them right here. Okay, and he came up with the idea that they had evolved to survive on the particular island that they ended up on. Okay. Now, remember, Lamarck would have said that they changed the shape of their beak to adapt to the food that was on that island. Is that a possible thing to do? Like if you're a bird and you land somewhere, can you like switch out your beak to a different attachment?
No.
No.
Good if you
No.
were a robot bird, but
Yeah, if you're a robot bird, but no, you can't do that. So evolution is not the bird changing its body. Evolution is maybe these four birds landed on an island. The one that had the beak that was best suited to eat the food there survives. Okay, that's what Darwin says, and that's what evolution says. And that's why he called it natural selection. Nature is selecting which one of these can survive on that particular island. Okay, they're not changing out their beaks. He published a very famous book, probably the most famous book in biology at least, called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. It has a much longer title, but we've shortened it to On the Origin of Species. So any questions on Darwin so far, or anything so far?
what is the longer version of that title?
It's just, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, I think.
That means like a whole page.
Yes.
For itself.
So, it's just a little bit longer, but they shorten it. Alright, you ready to go here? Alright, so some main ideas from his book and main ideas that still stand today. All populations show the ability to change from one generation to the next. We see that with people. You know, you see old-timey photographs of people, they don't look like the people that we have today. And they're not just changing their clothes either. It's like some of their physical characteristics are different. As a species, we're much taller than we used to be. We've gotten fatter as well than we used to be.
True.
So, you know, we're not talking about, you know, huge differences, but, you know, you can see notable differences over time.
What did we know like the people from Wild?
But we're on the right track to do that. The people that sit in their chairs and eat and drink and just watch TV the whole day. Yeah, a lot of people are like that already. So some terms, we've already had these terms. Remember, species are gonna be individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, and then a population is made up of species. There's not much to write on this one, so I'm gonna go. Alright, another main point of Darwin, competition and variation lead to natural selection. We already saw the variation with the different beaks, okay? But there was probably also some competition when they got to those islands. Who's gonna get the food, who's gonna get the mate, who's gonna get the territory, and then the strongest ones survive. That's where we get to this idea of the survival of the fittest. Darwin himself actually did not use that term, survival of the fittest. That's something that's been attributed to him, but he didn't really use it. But the idea is the same. He came up with the idea, just somebody else came up with that term. So the ones that are more suited for their environment are going to survive, first of all, and then they're also going to reproduce and pass on those selected traits to their offspring. Okay, and that's what fitness means in this case. Fitness in this case does not mean you went to the gym. Fitness means that you are fit to survive in that situation, and you can pass those traits on to your offspring. Questions on that? All right. All right. Another main point is if you are not fit, that can lead to extinction. There are some species that are not going to survive due to competition or some kind of trait. You know, something in their environment changes and they're not able to adapt to it, they might go extinct. Okay. Natural selection can also lead to what are called vestigial organs, which we'll talk about later, but who knows what a vestigial organ is?
It's like your appendix, you don't really need it.
Correct, yes.
What?
We have one, which is the appendix. Okay. The original function of the appendix, they believe, was to allow our ancestors to eat raw meat. There are some immune system responsibilities of the appendix. It does store some white blood cells that would be used to fight off the bacteria that was in the raw meat. However, we don't eat raw meat anymore, most of us, so we don't really use that, and if it goes bad, we can easily have it removed, and no harm, no foul to us.
Isn't that the same thing with the gallbladder?
Yes, yes.
What was your gallbladder for?
Your gallbladder helps you to break down fats. So, like I personally have had mine removed because it was it was full of gallstones. So I do have a little bit of an issue. I can't eat too many fats without feeling terrible, but you know, I'm okay. I'm here. I'm fine without a gallbladder. Yeah, it's horrible. So yeah, it's better if you know, if it becomes painful, get it taken out. You're
My
fine.
mom's getting this removed today.
Today?
Today, wow.
Yeah, it's not fun, but now I feel better. Okay, what else does it say? Okay, so natural selection can also lead to new species. So the species that were on the Galapagos of finches are going to be different than the originals that were in South America. They're going to be slightly the same, but slightly different. And that's called descent with modification. So like the ones on South America are the ancestors, the ones in the Galapagos are the descendants, but they have been modified.
And since they still do have the same basic species genes, they should be able to interbreed, right?
Possibly. Usually over time, some species can get so far apart that they can't interbreed any longer. We're going to talk about that. But yeah, if they're still close enough, like the only thing really different is their beaks, then they should be able to reproduce. But they have this big ocean in between them now, so they might not have the occasion to come in contact with each other to breed. Yeah.
That's like with lions and tigers and horses and
Donkeys.
yeah,
Yes.
they have ancestors. Their ancestors. They're different variations of the same ancestral species.
Correct. And that's what this says. Yeah, so Darwin also came up with this idea of the common ancestor, meaning an earlier parent species. So like for the Galapagos, their common ancestor is going to be those birds that came from South America, and then you have your different descendants with modifications. But all living things at some point have had a common ancestor because, you know, the first things on earth were those real simple things and we all descended from those things. So that's the idea of this common ancestor. Okay. And that's what evolution says. It doesn't say, nowhere in evolution does it say monkeys turned into people. Like, that's a misconception. But it says monkeys are related to people, which we are, because we can take a DNA test and find out you're 99% related to a chimp. So we're related. We did not descend from monkeys, but we're related to monkeys. Okay, so once Darwin kind of figured out his ideas, that was about almost 200 years ago now. You know, he came up with the idea that things change over time. He came up with the idea of natural selection. At that point, we still did not know anything about DNA. DNA was not discovered until about 100 years after Darwin. So he had the ideas, but he did not understand how genetics worked. Okay, and that's the only thing that kind of completed the puzzle with evolution, is once we figured out how genes work, we understood how these mutations occur to cause slight differences that give advantages to one bird over the other bird, basically. Okay. So mutations are changes in your genetic code. Sometimes mutations can be beneficial. Sometimes mutations are going to give you a disadvantage, and sometimes mutations don't have any effect. But the ones that give you an advantage are going to be the ones that allow you to survive and reproduce and do this whole natural selection thing. Any questions on that? Because I think that's where we're stopping today.